you. Yes, thank you for the introduction, Daryl. My name is Jasmin Kemper. I'm a Senior Technology Analyst at the IEA Greenhouse Gas R&D program, and I will give you a quick overview about carbon dioxide removal. And I'm first going to start with some slides about the IEAGHG. And it seems I cannot forward the slides myself, or does it work now? Oh, now it works. Okay, sorry for the delay in that. So who are we? We are the IEA Greenhouse Gas R&D program, or short IEAGHG. And we are a so-called technology collaboration program under the International Energy Agency's Energy Technology Network. And with that also comes a disclaimer. So although we are associated, we are functionally and legally autonomous. So the views, findings, and publications that you see from our side do not necessarily have to present the views of the IEA Secretariat in Paris or its individual member countries. And we were founded in 1991, and our main aim is to provide information on the role that technology can play in reducing greenhouse gas emissions from the use of fossil fuels and biomass in power and industrial systems, but also to have an eye on other energy carriers and also look at the whole energy systems level and the integration there. And our main focus in the past has historically been on carbon dioxide utilization and storage. And we also aim that our information that we produce mainly through our reports is objective, impartial, independent, policy relevant, but not policy prescriptive. And most of our reports are also reviewed by external expert reviewers to make sure that those criteria are fulfilled. So our primary activities, we are funding research into the development and deployment of CCUS technologies. We have, since we were founded, published more than 350 reports on all aspects of CCUS. And we also organize and run international expert networks on several topics, such as risk management, monitoring, modeling, environmental research, high temperature solid looping technologies, capture costs, and also social research. We are also involved in a couple of conferences. So we organize some of our own conferences, which is the GHGT conference, the post-combustion capture conference, and we are also involved by assisting as part of the scientific committee of the Negative Emissions Conference. We also run a summer school, and we also take part in several reviews of national programs, for example, for the US Department of Energy. And a quick advertising, if you have not been to a GHGT, one will take place this year in October for quite a long time, the first one in person again. So we all cordially invite you to join us in Lyon, in France, this October. And this slide just summarizes some of the organizations we are putting our information in and where we are active. That includes the IEA, especially the Working Party on Fossil Fuels, and also the CCUS unit, the Carbon Sequestration Leadership Forum, the Clean Energy Ministerial, the London Convention. Also, we are organizing CCS side events at the COPs. We also act as expert reviewers, and we are accredited observer of the IPCC. We are also active in the ISO and also in other organizations like the Zero Emissions Platform. And just a quick shout out to our members. They make our program possible. So we have member countries and also industrial sponsors, which you can see here on the slide. So now over to the overview on CDR. Daryl already has told you about the importance of negative emissions in the IPCC scenarios, especially in the new Working Group 3 report for AR6. And you can see that here in the slides that negative emissions will be important for 1.5 degree and 2 degree scenarios. And also the IPCC in their scenarios also then has several pathways. And you can see here from the slide, especially the graph on the left side, that the amount of negative emissions can differ greatly among the pathways, and also the sectorial makeup of who contributes to those negative emissions can be different. If we go a step back and look at the natural carbon cycles and if you look at the top left figure, that's the unperturbed carbon cycle and its fluxes. And you can see here that the atmosphere, the geosphere, and the land and ocean carbon sinks are in an equilibrium. And on the right side, top right side, you can now see what happened in the past. So what humans have done to this cycle, how we have influenced it and kind of tampered with it. So we've taken huge amounts of carbon out of the geosphere and dumped it into the atmosphere. And that has meant that land as well as ocean sinks have taken up some of that carbon, and those things have actually increased. And now on the top, on the bottom two pictures, you can see what actually will happen to the fluxes if we either aim for a net positive emission scenario with CDR or a net negative emission scenario. So really important is, of course, the one on the right side when we really want to get to negative emissions because we have put it in the atmosphere. So you could say it's our duty to take it back out there. And you can also then see, and that plays a different point in some points for discussion that I've summarized later, that taking it back and putting it back into the geosphere would actually mean that a new equilibrium will be established between land and ocean sinks and the atmosphere. So this can lead to some kind of rebound effects that have to be considered. Regards to CDR methods and taxonomy, this is kind of the new diagram, which is in the AR6 Working Group 3 report in Chapter 12. And what you can see here, what I really like about this picture is that it's no classification into nature-based versus technology approaches, which is good, because I think that's usually not too helpful. Instead, we have kind of a classification into the removal process. So that's biological, which is further divided into land-based and ocean-based, geochemical and chemical. And then also very importantly, we have a classification with terms to the duration of the storage. So you can see from that diagram that there are options that have kind of longer terms, more permanent storage, such as geological storage or storing in minerals, that there are also options that lead to a kind of less permanent and shorter term storage of the carbon. And then you can make the same carbon cycle diagrams just for some of the CDR options, and that is shown in this graph. So it shows you what happens or where will the carbon be taken from and where will it be stored. And you can see that, yeah, the reference example is using fossil fuel energy unabated, which means taking it out of the geosphere, putting it into the atmosphere. Then you would have bioenergy, not with CCS, so not a carbon removal option, but emissions reduction option. And there you would take it out of the atmosphere and via the land sink, take it into the atmosphere again, and then you have kind of a closed carbon cycle. You can now add on CCS to that, and that would actually mean you take carbon out of the atmosphere and put a large amount of that back into the geosphere. Carbon capture and storage, you can also do it just on fossil fuels, for example. Then you do not have negative emissions or carbon removal option, but you at least put what you've taken out back into the atmosphere, and in best case are net zero or neutral. Then we have other technologies like direct air capture and enhanced weathering, and they both take it directly out of the atmosphere and put it into the geosphere. And then options such as afforestation and ocean fertilization that do not work with the geosphere, but store it in the land sink or ocean sink. A lot of talk has recently come up with shall CDR employed, and there could be leakage from a CCS or CDR system, so should we do it at all? And this is from a publication from Professor Anders Lingfeld from Chalmers University, and it shows, well, we should probably still do it. There's like no good reason not to do it. And the bold line that you can see here is the reference. So you see the year on one axis, and then on the y-axis you see the concentration of CO2 in the atmosphere, and the bold red line is like what would happen if we would have no negative emissions technologies and methods. Then we would peak at around 2100 at 460 ppm in the atmosphere, and from there we would have a very long trajectory back down to pre-industrial emissions, which would take thousands of years to go back to. And the most bottom line, so the one with this red and dashed, that is actually the one where we have negative emissions, but we do not see any leakage. No leakage happens from any CDR technologies or approaches. And then we also peak, but then we go back rather quickly to lower concentrations in the atmosphere in the nearer term. And nearer term here means like 2100 and shortly after. And so it's short term in terms of how geologists think. And then you have several dashed lines there in between in black that you can see, and also the green one, and that are actually several scenarios. What happens if we assume there would be some leakage back from those systems? And you can still see that it would still very much make sense in the nearer term, because that's where our livelihoods are affected, to deploy those approaches. So now with regards to the different CDR methods, the IPCC report has some great material and tables summarizing all that information that's out there in the scientific arena on those methods. And you can see that the different methods first have a different maturity. So the technology readiness level can be quite different. They are kind of very mature options, for example, agroforestry, and soil organic carbon sequestration, and also direct air capture and bioenergy with carbon and capture and storage, relatively mature, still a bit under the commercial, very commercialized phase. But we also have options like ocean treatments, and which are in a very early stage. And also you can see that the costs are different.
Lagi di channel Jasmin Kemper. Pada kali ini kami akan memberikan informasi seputar dunia orang.
And the cost for some options, there are no data available, and you can also see that the potentials are quite different. And with the IPCC report, the options that were very much considered for a CDR are BECCS and DACS, and you can see the potential for DACS especially is really high, because it does not have constraints like land as you have in other options such as BECCS and also afforestation, reforestation. So, and this table also has a kind of lots of in the report, lots of caveats and trade-offs, and I've not put them in there because then you wouldn't be able to read the table. But working with one report has a nice overview graphic that shows you, yeah, what are the potentials and what are potential side effects in terms of how can albedo change and so on. So I'm not going to go into detail. The takeaway message is here that each option has their pros and cons and their trade-offs that need to be considered. We have already talked a bit about permanence. Permanence is not yet a really scientifically agreed on or defined term, but usually you have carbon storage methods such as in vegetation or soil carbon management, and those are relatively short term, in decades to centuries, and also they are more prone to reversal by human or natural disturbances. Then you have options like, for example, carbon in biochar, and that is also more shorter term scales, a bit less prone to reversal, but could still lead to a bit of decay. And then you have geological reservoirs up to 10,000 years or more and less prone for reversal. And CDR markets are also important because recently there were some activities by companies and they just found they could not buy enough what they defined as high quality carbon removals, and high quality included criteria for permanence, and they had a lot of options to kind of buy biosphere-based storage options with a relatively low, up to 100 years storage, but yeah, options for longer term storage such as DACS or BECCS were severely limited. And the two main options that we are investigating at IEAGHG at the moment are DACS, and there are different companies and technologies that are pursued that you can see here. So it's mainly at the moment divided into low temperature and high temperature approaches, and we have published a report on that. So if you want more information on the cost trajectories for nth of a kind and first of a kind, different configurations, you can check our report. And we also have done the same for BECCS. BECCS, there are lots of pathways for BECCS possible. So especially where does the biomass feedstock come? What is the conversion technology and what is the end product? And again, for this, we have also done a techno-economic assessment, which I happily invite you to download the report. And you can see that the costs and the key performance parameters, we have looked at 11 different ones, including like land and water use, and they can be really different depending on the technology and pathway. So that's important to keep in mind. So just throwing some points for discussion out there, it's important that we are clear whether we are talking about net zero, net negative, carbon or greenhouse gas removals. Methane removals might play a role in the future too. And important that CDR must not be pursued as a substitute for quick and robust action. Storage and permanence is of very high importance. And the temporal aspects can also play a role, and that was related to the rebound effects I mentioned earlier on the carbon cycle slide. It's also important different approaches will have different removal efficiencies, and it's important that they are well managed and manage to maximize the carbon storage. And I've hinted at that the markets for offsets and removals are rather immature at the moment, and some things that are really important there is to explore is which principles will be applied. Will we go for a polluter pays principle, or maybe even get a step further into carbon take-back obligations? And what's really important are robust monitoring, reporting, and verification for CDR, because some methods already have somewhat established MRVs, but others have not. And yeah, so it will be really important to think about all the cost implications, the potential bottlenecks, who will be the independent auditors, how will MRV be rolled out at scale, and so on. So with this, I'd like to thank you for the attention. And if you have any questions now or later.
Thank you, Jasmin. I think we can save the Q&A session for the end after we've had all three presentations. So I'll pass over to you, Helen, please.
Hi, just getting a bit of time to get my camera to work. Hi, Daryl, can you hear me?
Helen, I can hear you.
Yes, we can hear you fine.
Yep.
Hi, Arthur. Thanks very much for the invitation. And Jasmin, thank you for teeing it up so well. The research that is going on through the IEAGHG is very important. I'm going to spend a few minutes with you going through what carbon engineering does. We're a direct air capture technology provider. First, I'm going to share with you a little bit about why I became involved in carbon removal. Then we're going to look at what we're doing as carbon engineering, and then we'll share some trends at the end. Don't worry, it won't take long. And one thing I can guarantee is by the end of this presentation, probably what I've said will be out of date, because this is a fast moving sector. with many different technologies. If we go on to the next slide, just laying the scene a little bit, we all saw the IPCC Working Group 3 report with the role of carbon removal really being cemented, given that there are so many not only government-led net zero targets, but corporate net zero targets. And the chart on the left-hand side shows you those significant ramp up over the last couple of years in government setting these net zero targets. We wouldn't really be having this conversation without that action, both from governments and corporates. And then if you look on the right-hand side, the familiar emissions curve, and then this wedge below zero, which is carbon removal. And I really like the fact that Jasmin says, let's not get hung up about nature and tech. Let's look at the different types. All types are needed. And this sector needs to move and scale quickly if we are to keep within the Paris Agreement temperature goals. And this slide is taken actually from Frontier. You might have heard about the Frontier Climate Fund set up by a number of companies, Stripe, Alphabet, Meta, McKinsey, and Shopify, who've come together with an advanced market commitment of $925 million to buy permanent carbon removal by 2030. So I think, you know, it just feels like the last year or so has been an acceleration. We first started seeing the EU Commission came out with its scenario for net zero in November 2018, and that was when I first became interested. And I thought, what are all those technologies underneath the curve? How are we going to scale those, and how are we going to bring those to market in the times that we need? Because already by 2040, as you're seeing in that graph, in 2050, this is scaling at gigaton level. This is going to need some serious help from policy as well as front-leading companies. So if I go into the next slide, I'll quickly explain how carbon engineering is involved. So we're a technology provider, and we're totally reliant on plant developers globally. We made that strategic decision to be a technology provider because we couldn't scale at the pace we believe was important. We were founded in 2009. Professor David Keith from Harvard founded us, and we deliver direct air capture into two technology pathways. First of all, take it from the air, and with our partners, store it underground, geological storage, permanent geological storage. Or secondly, that CO2 can be combined with clean hydrogen and made into low carbon intensity fuels, mainly for the aviation and maritime markets. This has very names. It's called synthetic fuels or e-fuels or power to liquids, whatever you call it. But what I want you to know is it's near carbon neutral because you're taking that CO2 from the atmosphere, making something new, and then re-emitting the CO2. So it's a closed carbon loop. You're not taking any carbon dioxide from underground, from the geosphere, as Jasmin was talking about, and emitting it. So you're not adding to the total stock of carbon dioxide. And in order to scale at million-ton level, this is our ultimate purpose. We've chosen to use proven industrial equipment with existing supply chains, which enables us to scale at lower cost. We've been piloting and removing CO2 from the air since 2015 at our pilot plant in British Columbia, Canada, and we've made batches of fuels since 2017. So if you allow me, the next slide shows a little bit of how it works. And as I explained, it's fairly simple. It's using existing processes that you're all probably familiar with. So there are four main stages to the process and two closed chemical loops. First of all, you'll see the air contactor. This, if you can see behind me, this is our innovation center in British Columbia next to the old pilot plant. And the big fan on the top, that's what you can see. And beneath that is the plastic structure where you have the air contactors and you're trickling down that liquid solvent, sucking the air through so the solvent can grab as much carbon dioxide as possible. That carbon dioxide rich solution then goes into a pellet reactor. You switch over from potassium to calcium. You then basically create chalk with CO2, carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. You then fire that up in the calciner at high temperature to release the carbon dioxide. And then those pellets go round and regenerate. So you're regenerating both solvent and the pellets. You've got these two closed chemical loops. And that CO2 can either be, as I said, used for fuels, or it can be stored permanently underground. And because we use natural gas in our process to get to the high temperature heat, any CO2 from that process is co-captured. So you're storing more than 1 ton to get to that net negative. And that's what's super important for us. It has to be net negative. It has to be this carbon removal piece if we're going to be using the storage. And again, accounting for the whole life cycle is really, really important. So we move on to the next slide about what have we done. We talked a bit there about the pilot plant. You can see the innovation centre behind me. That's where we prove different types of process. That's currently commissioning. And then big on to the big plant. So our goal here is commercial scale. We saw a bit about the TRL level from Jasmin. And then basically, if you look to America is where there's a lot of activity. I'm sure there's lots of people from America on the call. There we're into engineering of a 1 million up to 1 million ton plant. Hopefully start construction of that with our plant developers 1.5, and that should start at the end of this year. Also in Europe, we have 2 plants in what we call pre-feed, one in the UK with plant developer Storegga, and that's around 500,000 to 1 million tons, and one in Norway, basically a site there selected right next to the Northern Lights CO2 transportation and storage infrastructure. Super exciting locations for us, both UK and Norway. And then on the fuel side, we're going through the front end planning, so pre-feed on a 100 million litre commercial scale fuels plant with the plant developer there, Heron Clean Energy. And you might have seen a recent announcement from us where with our strategic partners 1.5, which is part of Oxy Low Carbon Ventures, we're now partnering with them to deploy globally, and they have released their strategic intent to build 70 1 million ton plants by 2035, and that could be higher dependent on government policies. It's a super exciting time, and those plants can be used, the CO2 can be used in a number of ways. But what I'm wanting to say to you is it's happening, it's here, and we're at the start of a very exciting marketplace. And I think what's important is what we've been learning along the way is both compliance markets and voluntary markets have a role to play. And if I go to the final slide, I just want to talk a little bit about some of our customers. So we do have a few compliance markets globally where we can operate. I say a few, it's probably mainly the Californian Low Carbon Fuel Standards, which has a DACS, Direct Air Capture Storage Protocol. We don't really have inclusion in the EU, though we do have a certification mechanism coming along, and I'm sure we'll hear about in the next presentation. But we've got a lot of support happening at US federal level and also Canadian government. So North America definitely leading the charge there and deploying this really important technology to get to net zero. But also a lot of what we do and with our plant developers and with 1.5 is these customers here, mainly software, Bank of Montreal, banking, e-commerce platforms, tech type companies have pre-purchased. Back to Jasmin's point of there's none of this available now. No, you're right, we're not making it now, but we plan to be making it from 24 with our plant developers. And the most recent trade I'd like to make you aware of is from Airbus, who have pre-purchased 400,000 tons of carbon removal from the planned plant in the Permian Basin in America. This is the biggest type of pre-purchase the market has seen to date. So super exciting time, and we'll keep hearing more and more about these types of advanced market commitments, advanced purchases. This is a really important route to market for us, but we also call for compliance markets. Having said that, really important that emissions reductions happens first, and we gain that license to operate because removals is only one part of how we get to net zero. You have to have that accelerated emissions reductions. So in summary, on this path to net zero, carbon engineering is playing its part in helping to deploy DAC in a feasible, affordable and commercial scale. And as a technology partner with 1.5, we are looking for more partners in more markets and more supporting customers, if I may have a pitch. And I'd ask you if you would consider in your companies, if you're responsible for designing your company's net zero strategy, that you find a role for permanent high integrity carbon removal, and this enables net zero emissions. Thank you for listening, and I think I pass now back to Daryl. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Helen, for sharing about carbon engineering and the interesting work you're doing. I'll pass on to Edvard, please, for the final presentation.
Thanks, Daryl. And thanks to IEAGHG for hosting the webinar. Hello, everyone. Good afternoon. My name is Edvard. I work for Clean Air Task Force as a policy manager on carbon capture. Just a quick overview, I guess, of who we are. So Clean Air Task Force is an international climate organization, a non-profit. And we were originally formed in the United States about 25 years ago, originally focused on sort of reducing air pollution from coal plants. And now we focus on advancing key decarbonization technologies, which are essential to reach net zero in the global energy system. So one of those that we sort of focus on is what we call carbon management. So this would be sort of carbon capture, obviously, from point sources, which I also work on. But also today we're going to focus on carbon removal. And so this would be involving other sort of methods to capture CO2, and these ones would be sort of removing from the atmosphere, which Jasmin has really well explained, and also Helen has given insight, I guess, into the specific technology of direct air capture. So yeah, so this is our basically our thesis. So we support carbon management. We think it's an essential part of any strategy for every member for sort of states and governments and regions to reach net zero. And carbon management also encompasses carbon removal, and it's important. Obviously, I think it's been stated, which I think most people seem to accept, that carbon removal must not replace what we're doing already with emissions reductions. It makes more sense from an efficiency point of view, and also from in order to reach our net zero targets, we're going to have to reduce emissions first. Nonetheless, we at CATF, we consider that carbon removal has three sort of key complementary functions in the way it could have addresses climate change mitigation. And so the first is in the sense of that it actually reduces emissions, at least in the near term, as we begin to scale various different carbon removal methods. And the second is obviously they were going to have some residual emissions in 2050 and perhaps beyond, which can come from some sectors, perhaps in the agricultural sector. And so we're going to need carbon removals to sort of balance these out. And then in third, which is probably going to be occurring after my lifetime, at least, when we're going to reach net negative emissions. So there's a lot of CO2 obviously in the atmosphere, and we're going to have to go beyond net zero and reaching net negative in the future. And so for us, if you look in the graphic on the right hand side, it's sort of a very simple, I guess, in terms of how we view carbon removal. For us, it sort of encompasses three key principles. And those are that carbon removal has to be real, it has to be measurable, and it has to be permanent. And so that, whatever way you look at it, if it's coming from so-called, we also disagree with the sort of framing of nature-based and technological solutions, very much following what the IPCC has kind of tried to reform them. But nonetheless, sort of these key core principles, what we see carbon removal as having to obtain. And that's obviously going to feed into what I'm going to discuss about in a bit on the certification aspect. And so, yeah, just from a sort of a policy perspective, I think from CATF, I mean, we are primarily trying to influence. I think someone's mic is on. Okay. Yeah, so from our perspective, I mean, we are very much a policy-focused nonprofit, and so for us, we really try to influence two key stakeholders in between. And yeah, I will move the slide in a sec. Yeah, so we're really trying to influence government on the one hand. I was just muted. Yeah, so that we're trying to influence government, which means they need to lend some political recognition to carbon management. And that means creating sort of appropriate and stringent frameworks for how it can develop. And then at the same time, we're also really focused on addressing industry, who really need to make sure that they can show that carbon management, and this goes for point source carbon capture as well, that it can be done safely and responsibly, especially in the near term, because that's how we're going to need to scale up these things quickly. So I'm not able to change this.
I can move the slides for you if you.
Okay, no problem. Yeah, let's go to the next slide. Thanks. So yeah, I'm based in Brussels, so I primarily focus on EU policy. I also have colleagues who focus on CDR policy in the US, if you ever want to get in contact. So carbon removal in Europe tends to be quite a difficult topic to discuss, at least in a policy level. That's sort of because of the way it's sort of framed in terms of how it addressed the overall strategy of trying to reduce emissions and how can we can maintain emissions reductions in the first place. So nonetheless, the EU has a target or sort of a commission scenarios from their own sort of estimates that we're going to need around about 500 million tons a year going to have to be removed of CO2 equivalents in 2050. And this sort of came about as well of sort of the IPCC's report in 2018 on reaching 1.5, and then also the more recent report from AR6 in sort of which recognized the need to scale CDR. And so last December, the Commission came out with a communication called the Sustainable Carbon Cycles, and what this sort of proposed was sort of showing the objectives of the Commission and therefore the EU that we would try to in the future, and the quote is sort of to further achieve the further integration of carbon removals into the EU regulatory and compliance frameworks post 2030. So currently, I mean, even pre-2030, we have carbon removals happening already, and they account for some of our sort of emissions accounting at member states. And so we include these in what we call the land use change and forestry regulation. It's called the LULUCF. And so averaging around about 290 megatons a year of CO2 equivalents, although this is declining year on year. That's generally due to the sort of degradation of forestry areas and other areas of biodiversity. But currently at the EU, we don't actually have a policy framework for CDR, though that's sort of beginning to change now with the communication on sustainable carbon cycles. And within that, you also have this sort of aspirational target that was sort of mentioned of 5 million tons a year of what they call industrial removals. So this would probably be direct air capture and bioenergy carbon capture and storage. And so they want to achieve this by 2030. And we have already seen some projects even starting. So even in some member states, for example, in Sweden, they seem to be very active in trying to further bioenergy carbon capture and storage, and within the Innovation Fund, which is a sort of vehicle that the EU Commission uses in order to sort of advance specific technologies that can reduce emissions. You've already seen a bioenergy carbon capture storage plant or facility has been included. And then also in Germany, more recently, the coalition treaty among the three parties, which came out last October, they will include a priority of trying to reach or to advance negative emissions within the lifetime of this government. So we can go to the next slide. So in Europe, in the views of sort of CATF, we have a couple of things that we really think need to be addressed. So for us, I mean, first and foremost, at least in a legal sense, we need to try and come up with a definition for what actually carbon dioxide removal is. And this will mean sort of encompassing sort of core definition principles. They can obviously use ours, but there's also it needs to be addressed in terms of deciding when a ton of CO2 is actually removed. What we also need to ensure, I'm sure they're well aware, is that CDR doesn't reduce sort of or compromise our ability to reduce emissions. We also need to create a business case, and so we'll get on a sec of exactly where the first step for this business case is going to come from. We already have compliance markets in the EU, so we have obviously the emissions trading system. So potentially that could be a vehicle for financing carbon removals, but then there's also other ways, for example, through public procurement, or also sustainable products. And now also we need to really make sure that we assess where the impacts of these sort of carbon removal methods can have in our net zero sort of energy system. For example, direct air capture is, I've seen quite a lot of targets of a gigaton scale or even beyond by 2050. But obviously direct air capture has a lot of energy requirements, and that's just an example. There's other boundaries that we're going to have to see as well when it comes to bioenergy carbon capture, and there's other sort of more land use or land related terrestrial sinks, carbon farming, for example. They may have effects on biodiversity or even on our ability to obtain energy sources, and so we're also going to need to ensure that we have sufficient carbon-free electricity. We're going to have to make sure that we have enough critical minerals, especially for looking at aspects related to electricity storage. And then also at CO2 transport and storage is going to be a key priority. You know, in a certain sense, you're going to have a lot of direct air capture, bioenergy carbon capture facilities. Those same facilities are going to have to use the infrastructure that's going to have to develop for sort of CCS, at least in the near term. It means sort of pipelines, shipping, CO2 storage sites. And also a critical element that shouldn't be forgotten is the international dimension. So that means working with the UK, other sort of the United States and other sort of global organizations as non-governmental as well as governmental, as well as international companies as well, so we can advance carbon removal and ensure that we sort of have a clear market for real, measurable and permanent removals in the long term. Next slide, please. So I kind of alluded to it, and that's sort of going to be the main point of discussion in this presentation, is sort of the carbon removal certification mechanism. So as I mentioned, it was included in the communication from the Commission in December. It's, long story short, it's essentially the first initiative by a public entity in the world to certify carbon removals. And essentially what it does is it kind of, the idea behind it is that it's going to measure that when is a ton of CO2 removed actually a ton of CO2 removed. And the idea behind it is that, eventually we need to get into sort of funding carbon removals with policy incentives. But before we get there, we have to have an accounting mechanism set up with a clear sort of regulatory framework in terms of actually determining how or when a ton of CO2 is removed, and having sort of a certification process for this also to be developed. So the Commission is actually working on this at the moment. We've been engaging with some other NGOs and sort of other private entities as well, and sort of trying to educate them or provide our sort of input in terms of how we think of it as an environmental community. And so what we're going to see is in December 2022, so at the end of this year, the Commission will propose a sort of regulation, and that will apply across to all 27 EU member states. And then it will go through the sort of legislative process in the Parliament and then onto the Council throughout the 2023. So perhaps in 2024 it could be adopted. Next stage. So we've already seen sort of what CATF thinks of as in terms of what carbon removal is. So that's on the blue side. So for us, real carbon removal is when CO2 is removed from the atmosphere and stored durably. Measurable is in the sense of we actually have an idea of how much quantities of CO2 are being removed. And this requires sort of robust monitoring and reporting and verification rules. And then for us also, permanence is a key requirement. So what this means is that if the durability of CO2 storage, in one end could be long-term and geological formations on the order of millennia. But for us, it's also important that, for methods where CO2 isn't removed or isn't stored durably, that we have the sort of appropriate legal and financial mechanisms in place to ensure that sort of storage is going on into perpetuity. And so then on the right side, and I mean, this is relevant for the certification mechanism, we have these sort of 4 key principles, what we think is critical in terms of how the mechanism should be set up. So first is sort of that it should ensure additionality. So what this means is essentially that, actions are leading to greater amounts of CO2 are being removed, not ones that are already currently ongoing. So for example, we would not want a company to buy a forest and then claim that they are removing CO2. We want more areas to be forested, or more areas to incur soil carbon, or also more direct air capture, bioenergy carbon capture and storage facilities to be built. We also need to ensure that we have avoidance of leakage. So that means, we don't want our emission sources to simply move outside of the EU and go elsewhere, because for the climate perspective, that doesn't actually do anything. And then also we want to avoid double counting. So obviously that means, measuring when a ton of CO2 is removed, that it's only 1 ton that we are measuring at a time. And then also sustainability, and it's kind of a vague term, but for us, it really means that, we understand and we design within the framework that, when we're developing carbon removals, like we talked a little bit about, and sort of how it has systemic effects, that we don't compromise on our sort of biodiversity and ecosystems, because negative externalities can come from overdoing it, let's say. And we've seen this in plenty of other examples in the past in developing carbon removals. And so we need to ensure that, proper social and environmental considerations are considered, as well as their implications, and that, through ensuring strict regulation for CER, we can ensure that it has no net harm on the environment and the people around it. So next slide. So I think Jasmin had an excellent graphic from the IPCC, and sort of outlines the problem with the sort of binary look of nature-based versus technological removals. And it should flag that we also agree with that, but for the purposes of a certification mechanism, in order to trying to sort of dealing with a sort of at times difficult political environment in the EU, which tends to sort of lump carbon farming and, let's say, direct air capture together. For us, we are trying to ensure that we sort of separate out what we call sort of long cycle versus short cycle removals. And what that means is essentially, when you're taking CO2 from the geosphere and it's coming in the form of obviously fossil fuels, that in order to actually return CO2 to in a permanent location and on the order of centuries to millennia, that we would define this as sort of long cycle removals. And then also when it comes to sort of CO2 that's removed from the atmosphere via afforestation or from carbon farming, that it's not on the order of millennia, but it's on the order of decades to centuries potentially. And so for us, what it means is that when the certification mechanism is designed, that we want to make sure that there's sort of no fungibility between these credits, right? So that if you're a farmer and you're operating a soil carbon farming project, that your certificate is not the same as a certificate, let's say, for a ton of CO2 removed via a direct air capture facility that's stored in a geological storage space for millennia. And that's for various reasons. Obviously, one is the reason of costs and scaling up, but also in terms of the carbon accounting, that in the long run, we are going to need to store gigatons worth of CO2 in the geosphere. And it's important that we made that distinction, at least in a regulatory sense, and that starts with early on. So that's the sort of, I guess, how we've been trying to educate the Commission in a sense that, there are sort of different carbon cycles that occur. And when it comes to actually setting up the certification mechanism, and then also in terms of how those certificates are going to be used, that they bear this in mind. So we got the next slide. So for us, we're sort of looking at in terms of how can we facilitate innovative CDR methods. So as Helen kind of alluded to, the space is moving extremely fast. There's a lot of private investment going on, and it's also good that there's a lot of innovation occurring. And the problem with creating a regulatory framework is that you might base it off of what is available today, but tomorrow there could already be new technologies, new methods that are available that can reduce CDR, that can reduce CO2 from the atmosphere. So for us, we've kind of looked at it and worked with other NGOs to try and understand in terms of how can we retain regulation, but then also with sort of maintaining its sort of environmental integrity, but then at the same time retaining sufficient sort of flexibility in terms of how new methods that may not exist in the future, maybe not exist at the moment, or maybe only at prototype level, and maybe don't have strict accounting or very good ideas of MRV, how can they be integrated into the CRCM in the future? And so for us, we kind of envisage a little bit of a three-stage process. So what this could be is sort of in the first stage, providing some public recognition for a new method, maybe that sort of removes CO2, but maybe the calculations or the measurement criteria isn't being met in terms of how accurate it is. But nonetheless, it sort of provides a little bit of recognition for these new methods that, okay, in the future, with some research and some innovation and more investment, maybe it could be part of the CRCM. And then the sort of second stage would be working with the Commission, other entities that are sort of running the certification mechanism to ensure that we have established sort of recognized methodologies and retain to meet the core minimum standards that I sort of alluded to. And then the third stage would be sort of fully recognizing a new method of CDR as being part of the mechanism. So we go to the next slide. So obviously another big issue is in terms of how the governance structure is to be set up for this certification mechanism. And sort of going to be quite difficult in terms of determining where the roles, I guess, between the public and the private sectors and sort of lines are sort of be drawn. Because on the one hand, the public sector has to this point been the ones leading on carbon removal, not just in the investment sense, but also in the creating accounting mechanisms and monitoring, reporting, and verification. And we also at CATF, we think that the private sector can play a very important role in this. But nonetheless, it's going to be quite difficult to determine in sort of where the development of these methodologies and stuff are going to come from. And there's various different aspects to govern it in terms of who will be responsible, how will it be governed. Given the order, I think I need to move on a bit, but I have it in. I can also share after the presentation. You can see our submission, which is far more detailed in terms of where we see the lines being drawn between the public and private sector. So you can find more information about it there. Let's go to the next slide. Sorry. Yeah, so I think that was mainly the presentation. I think now it's pretty important to get to a Q&A aspect, but I'm sure we'll also share some details and some materials you've prepared on the CRCM. And if you have any questions ever, feel free to reach out to me via email or any of my colleagues, and be happy to take a meeting. Thanks.
Thank you, Edvard. So apologies, we're overrunning a bit, but I'll pass to Arthur Lee for the Q&A, and if some of the presenters or audience could stay a few minutes longer, that would be great. Thank you.
Yes, thank you, Daryl. Thank you, Edvard. I think we have quite a bit of chats going on, but I'd like to take the moderator's prerogative to ask one question of all panelists, okay? Because most of the questions really were directed to one or two people. So for all three panels, I would like to ask you about the fact that there seem to be some trend towards differentiating the price in the carbon markets between emission reduction units, tons, versus some carbon removal tons. So what's your opinion on that? If I could just ask all three of you about whether that's justified or whether there's all the basis behind that. So please.
If I might be able to suggest, if Helen, if you have an answer, if you could go first, as you have to leave on time. Yeah, thank you.
And Arthur, I might not have understood your question correctly. I think Edvard put it quite well in saying that not all carbon removal is created equally. All carbon removal is needed, but there's different types in terms of short cycle and long cycle. But in terms of looking at emissions reductions versus removals, they are quite different things that you're doing. So if you're capturing CO2 from an industrial stack, that obviously is going to be more economic than capturing it from the air, purely because of the concentration of the CO2. And I think in order to gain license to operate and recognition that emissions reductions and emissions removals are very different, you need to have a different way of recognizing them. It might be in the longer term that your removals price will be the same as a reductions price, but what actually the impacts on the atmosphere and on the carbon budget, that's the important thing. So for me at the moment, I don't like to mix emissions reductions with emissions removals. They're very different. They have very different outcomes on the climate. Arthur, does that answer your question?
Yes, you're one of the answers. So thank you, Helen. How about the other panelists? If I could direct that same question to you. Jasmin,
would you mind repeating the? Would you mind repeating the question?
It's about differentiating about the emission reduction, and the carbon market seems to suggest that there may be some trending now towards differentiating pricing between reduction and between removal directly from the atmosphere. So can you?
Yeah, I mean, I think. Yeah, I mean, I think the voluntary carbon market has a lot of problems, and I think that this is one of them. And obviously, differentiating between emissions reductions and emissions removals is something that's generally consensus among everybody working inside the carbon removal and carbon capture sort of communities. And not conflating them, I think, is really critical, because sometimes, or a lot of times actually at the political level, there is a sort of mixing up between when a ton of CO2 is taken from the air or when it's taken from a flue gas point source. At the same time, though, I think there is more that could be done among the community, and particularly in the direct air capture community, in terms of outlining the synergies, because point source carbon capture and storage tends to get quite a bad rep. It's not quite a popular topic to discuss, at least in Europe. But for some reason, direct air capture tends to be seen, and obviously it's more of a new technology. But I think there could be more done to create the synergies in terms of the infrastructure that we need. And by this, I mean building out, storage, CO2 storage sites, of which we're way behind in terms of what we're going to need even by 2030. And also in terms of CO2 pipelines, CO2 ships, and the sort of regulations that come with that, and the sort of policy frameworks that are developed to push those forward. That's something I think that we can work together I think, between the sort of actors involving in the private sector on direct air capture and bioenergy carbon capture, but also sort of the industrial sector, right? So the cement, steel plants that are going to need carbon capture and storage as well. I think that that's something that we could do, and we can chew gum and walk at the same time, and make sure that the conflation of emissions reductions and removals is maintained. But at the same time, we're all in this together in a sense as a sort of carbon management industry, and I think we can do more to try and make that clear at the political level.
Thank you, Edward. How about thank you for that, Jasmin? You have any thoughts on that? Well?
Yes, I mean, I tend to agree with the previous two speakers with regarding to keeping it separate, because I think it's important because the services provided are different. And I also think that it's very important that a lot of metrics are very cost-based, and we have different cost parameters that are reported in different publications, such as capture cost, avoidance cost, and removal cost. And what's sometimes lacking is, I mean, it's a very complex research area to kind of define and talk about the value of those different options. So each option has different trade-offs. And for example, if we take direct air capture, it consumes energy and it provides a carbon removal service, for example. And then if we look at BECCS, it actually produces energy and provides a carbon removal service. So it uses some of the energy that it produces to do so, but it's still a net producer, right? And also we can think, especially for BECCS, of also multi-use forestry systems, for example. So you have forestry managed, it produces products that we all need, like timber, but also some residues could be used for BECCS. And then it's really about managing to maximize the carbon removal efficiency of those systems. So I think that's one thing that will be really important. And it was also highlighted, like on 2 days ago, the Intergovernmental Science and Policy Platform on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services, also known as the IPCC for Biodiversity. They actually published their summary for policymakers, and they really highlighted that and the conclusion was that because of the market-based focus and short-term profits, this has meant that the wider benefits of nature system have been ignored, and that should be considered more in the future. And it's also important for the SDGs in this context. So, yeah.
Good. Thank you, Jasmin, for pointing out the kind of the co-benefits aspects of some of these more natural climate nature-based kind of solutions. So thank you. I think a lot of the chatting going on. Let me just go through that a little bit. Maybe we'll close out. I think it's it has to do with also national determinations about whether, like the EU. Edward is pointing out that the EU is going through this process now of certification mechanism. So does that mean that the EU would favor the deployment of such technologies earlier? And if so, does that mean that what does that mean for the rest of the world? I'm paraphrasing and trying to consolidate some of the chatting going on. Edward, do you want to answer that as well?
Yeah, I mean, I think the EU tends to view itself as very much a climate leader, and that obviously is going to be tested over the coming years, particularly in the current energy crisis. And that, and being a climate leader is more than just advancing renewable energy. There's a lot more to advancing or to reducing our emissions and actually being a climate leader in the future. And that involves also advancing carbon removal technologies. And I think there's a greater awareness now that, if the EU do it, and working obviously with the US and the UK as well, that we need to make sure that these technologies can scale and commercialize in order to reduce their costs, so that they get developed and deployed across the world as well. And that goes not just for carbon removal, but a lot of other technologies, hydrogen, carbon capture and storage, geothermal, whatever it is, we really need to take on a leading role in terms of advancing these technologies, just like we've done before with renewables, with wind and solar, for example. So I think that there's a greater sort of consciousness, yes, among the EU in order to advance these technologies in the near term. But yeah, again, with the caveat of not wanting to compromise our work on emissions reductions.
Okay, I know Daryl wants me to get off, but can I just ask one more? This one, just to be fair to Jasmin as well. Jasmin, if you could. And Helen's still here. Good.
Yeah, I'm happy to go to give a direct air capture perspective.
Please go ahead. Go ahead. Then.
All jurisdictions are kind of moving, but doing different things first. So the UK is super exciting. We've already seen on the chat the 5 megatons aspirational target. They've come out with a call for evidence on engineered GGRs under their emissions trading system. They have their business models out for consultation. It's super exciting market. The EU, we've just heard all about the certification mechanism, and then a kind of some motions from the Parliament wanting to look at how to integrate negative emissions under the emissions trading system, and it will need to be discussed at length and to be done well. And then you go over to America and you see, on the table there's $3.5 billion for DAC hubs to be spent over the next 5 years. Super exciting, and the tax incentives from the Canadian government. So when you look at the pace of change, I would potentially argue that North America is in the lead here. And this is all good for the sector. But we tend to see a slightly more cautious approach from the EU27, but with both potentially the UK wanting to go a bit quicker. So that's quite a controversial, quite a clear view. But as a direct air capture technology provider, this is what we're sensing from governments. Yeah. Great,
thank you.
I would agree as well with that. I would agree with that as well completely. By the way, the EU is not doing nearly enough to advance carbon management, carbon capture and storage, direct air capture. Not enough is being done.
Okay, great. Let me go to Jasmin to close out. Jasmin, if you could just say something more about the other kind of CDR and talk about the value of some of it. I know we were talking just now about price and cost, but how about the value of some of the more natural climate solutions that I think you were starting to talk about?
Yes, I started on my last comment, and that's actually important because, I mean, it's not just that we want to remove carbon from the atmosphere. We also want to continue living like a life in well-being and in health. And so, yeah, it's important to, I mean, it's a lot of work, and usually you have work kind of focused, narrowed down on a cost aspect or on an environmental aspect. And the important thing is to really bring it all together. And it will, because every option will have trade-offs and benefits, it will eventually lead to different approaches being applied in different countries. So different countries will have different portfolios of what option they will favor. For example, I'm from Germany, and when I finished my PhD on post-combustion capture, CCS activity and research was on the low. The storage projects like from Vattenfall, Schwarze Pumpe, they were cancelled. And all of a sudden it was like, nothing will be happening. So I moved over to the UK and to continue here. And yeah, and that's things that can happen. But the problem is we are clearly running out of time. We cannot allow for more kind of procrastination or more delays. And that's also what the IPCC 6 assessment cycle has shown. They put a lot of effort also on behavioral changes. So it's not just that we can delude ourselves that in 10 or 20 years' time, we will just remove large amounts of CO2 from the atmosphere and that's it. We need to be also very adamant about emissions reductions. And as my co-speakers here said before, it's not an excuse not to do emissions reductions. So it should not distract from doing emissions reductions, behavioral changes especially. So we need really all means now that we can.
Great. Thank you. And on that note, let me just say I think there is some consensus. I mean, reduction and advancement of these technologies, natural as well as engineered. I think that we need it all. So let me turn it over to Daryl.
Thank you very much, Arthur. So just to close off, a huge thank you to Jasmin, Helen and Edvard, our excellent presenters for this webinar. And to all of you on the line who're still on the line, I know we overran a bit, so thank you for your patience and staying on. But please, as I mentioned earlier, a recording of this webinar will be available in the next couple of days to all registrants with a link to the slides and with the details the speakers have provided. So yeah, thank you and have a great rest of the week and stay safe. Goodbye.
Thank you.
Thank you, Arthur.